Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to AEI, this palatial think tank that we get to attend this afternoon. I'm actually pretty excited about this session because, in some ways, it's very unique. It's a debate about carbon tax, with no one on the panel being an environmentalist, except the moderator. No one on the panel being a Democrat, no one on the panel being a liberal, and yet it's a debate about a carbon tax. And so that's what we're talking about, is not the debate as to whether how strong is the argument for a carbon tax, but how strong is the conservative argument for a carbon tax. And that's what I think is going to be fun and perhaps unique. It's only recently, I think one could say, that there has been a conservative argument for a carbon tax. Now there are several, and certainly the one that is probably most prominent is the Climate Leadership Council, which many of you have heard about, that entitled, quote, "The Conservative Case for Carbon Dividends." It included the luminaries like George Shultz and James Baker, joined by several big oil companies and big corporations. So a pretty prominent initiative. Then there's the Alliance for Market Solutions, which is entirely run by Republicans. The whole purpose is to enact or get a carbon tax enacted. I think Jerry Taylor at Niskanen probably started out earliest in making the argument, a conservative argument for a carbon tax, but he was joined quickly by former Congressman Bob Inglis from South Carolina, who started an initiative. But the absolute first, Doug will remind us, is John McCain in 2001 was the first one to ever argue for putting a price on carbon from the Republican side. He joined with Joe Lieberman to make a bipartisan proposal, but nonetheless, 2001 is pretty early as these discussions go. So let me just talk about the issue briefly, just some of the facts about the issue so that we're all homed in on the basics. We're talking about taxing carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide represents about 3/4 of global greenhouse emissions. The global carbon dioxide emissions were about 37 billion tons last year, up about 23% from 2005. And that's brought us concentrations in the atmosphere of 405 parts per million, roughly 35% higher than human beings have ever experienced in the 200,000 years or so that we've been on the planet. And it's increasing right now at a rate of about 2 parts per million per year. It also has made the ocean 30% more acidic. First time in 50 million years that we've seen that kind of change in the ocean. The U.S., interestingly, is only 15% of that total, 5 billion metric tons. Noteworthy, though, for being down 14% since 2005 versus the rest of the globe up 23%. So when we're talking about a tax on carbon, each ton of carbon, each dollar per ton would represent about a tax collection of around $5 billion. Or if you took the Climate Leadership Council proposal of $43 a ton, you'd be talking about roughly 5% of federal tax take. So those are just sort of the basics of what we have to talk about. So what do we hope to get out of today's discussion? Well, I'm a guy who always looks for common ground, and that's what I'll be looking for here. And I'm probably naive to think that we're going to get there. But at least we're starting with 4 conservatives. And I hope that there's going to be some commonality in the way they approach the topic. I think one thing that everyone would agree, I don't know, Marlo, I haven't asked you this, I asked Ben, I think we'd agree that there's a non-zero risk that human activity is causing climate change. Non-zero.
I don't even think it's a risk. I mean, I'm convinced that we are having an influence on the climate because of our greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay, so
right.
we're probably in agreement that it's something greater than zero. Maybe the differences in what percentage we'd apply to that is going to be quite large, but there's that agreement. I think because of the obvious factual nature of it, we'd all agree that CO2 emissions are increasing the acidity of the ocean. So that's some common ground, but finding more is going to be tough, and that's nevertheless what we'll try to do. I hope you have that same aspiration. So here's the plan. We'll start with Ben Zeiker, who really put this event together, and as a resident scholar here at AEI, will present the arguments against the conservative case for a carbon tax. Then my great friend Erwin Stelzer will follow by, who's a senior fellow at Hudson Institute, who will present the arguments for the conservative case for a carbon tax. And that'll be followed by a panel discussion really between Marlo Lewis and Doug Holtz-Aiken, and we'll hope that then will lead to some time for question and answer in the audience. If all goes well, we'll finish here at 5 o'clock. With that, let me turn it over to you, Ben, to give you 20 minutes to make your case, and we'll about the same time for you, Erwin.
Okay.
Okay, well, thank you, Roger. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for joining us today for this, I think will be quite an interesting discussion. As Roger mentioned, the Climate Leadership Council, headed by Ted Halstead, has made an important proposal for a carbon tax. There's a proposal from Congressman Curbelo, I think.
Former.
No, he is still in office, and whether he won or lost has nothing to do with the merits of the issue. I'm not going to start beating up on him for that reason. And I think he received some help in his proposal from the Niskanen Center. There's the Americans for Carbon Dividends, which I've not seen a separate proposal for them. I think they're more of a lobbying organization for the CLC proposal. It doesn't really matter. So typically in these proposals, there's a carbon tax starting at something on the order of $24, $25 to $40 or roughly dollars per ton, which translates to about 21 to 34 cents per gallon of gasoline. And in all of these proposals, the tax rises in real terms, in other words, faster than inflation indefinitely. The CLC claims to be revenue neutral by returning all the revenues to the American people. I'll have more to say about that revenue neutrality claim in a few minutes. The Curbelo proposal is for a not revenue neutrality in any sort of sense, but a replacement of the federal fuels tax combined with subsidies for coastal states and other interests. All of the proposals to preserve competitiveness incorporate a border carbon adjustment, rebates for exports, and fees imposed on imports to and from economies not adopting a similar policy. The proposals, the CLC proposal calls for a reduction in the existing, what was then the Obama administration greenhouse gas regulatory regime. And the Curbelo proposals for a temporary moratorium, but not an elimination of whether it's the Obama regime or the newer Trump regime, depending on how that evolves. But all the proposals call for a greater reduction in greenhouse gas emissions than was the case envisioned under the Obama Climate Action Plan. What that means is higher energy costs. I'll come back to that. And all of the proposals claim that a tax will engender greater policy predictability than is the case for a regulatory approach, and I'll talk about that as well. There are two major arguments made for a carbon tax, the first of which is as an insurance policy against the possible adverse future effects of increasing greenhouse gas concentrations. So the question is any economist should ask, how much insurance are we getting? In other words, what is the predicted effect on temperatures in the year 2100 as predicted by, let's say, the EPA climate model, which is the climate model that the federal government uses to analyze the future temperature and other effects of its greenhouse gas regulatory proposals. Well, it turns out if you run that model, both the CLC and the Curbelo proposals would reduce temperatures in the year 2100 by about 3/100ths of a degree, which would not be measurable simply because the natural variability of temperature over time is a good deal greater than that, about 11/100ths of a degree in terms of the standard deviation for the land-ocean record. So when I mention this to people, often, not always, but often the response is, yes, we understand the U.S. can't do that much alone, but this should be part of an international approach that would be much more meaningful. So let's ask the question, if we apply that model to the Obama administration commitments made in Paris at COP21, what would the temperature effect of that be in the year 2100? The answer is 17/100ths of a degree, a little bit more than the standard deviation, but not that much. If you define what I call an aggressive policy, which is the U.S. reduction in greenhouse gas emissions below 2005 levels of 27%, a 20% reduction by the Chinese, a 30% reduction by the rest of the industrialized world, and a 20% reduction by the rest of the developing world, you get a little bit more than half a degree, which may or may not be a meaningful effect, depending on one's point of view. I think it's rather dubious to call that saving the planet, but that again is a matter of taste. In brief, I think the insurance argument for a carbon tax cannot pass any plausible benefit cost test simply because the taxes that are being proposed, I'll get to the political issue in a minute. The taxes that are being proposed have temperature effects that are so small that I think they can't justify the costs. And this has nothing to do with assumptions about the underlying science and dangers of anthropogenic climate change. With respect to the costs, the COP21, the Paris Agreement, if you buy the nationally determined contributions as being meaningful, I don't, but if you buy them, the costs would be something on the order of 1% to 2% of GDP globally every year that would be imposed disproportionately upon the world's poor. That's why we're seeing vociferous complaints. That's why we have a Green Climate Fund as part of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And 2 months ago, we heard nothing but loud complaints from the less developed economies about how much money has actually been committed to the Green Climate Fund. I think it's now $12 billion or something like that. I've got to go back and look. The argument that the Green Climate Fund is actually going to start raising $100 billion a year, beginning in a little more than a year, I think is deeply dubious. Then there's the efficiency argument, the argument that a tax is more efficient than regulation. And the vast majority of my fellow economists make this argument. And the argument's really quite straightforward. Look, regulations impose a one-size-fits-all approach on everyone that can't be efficient. A tax allows every emitter to reduce emissions in a way that minimizes the cost of doing so, and therefore a tax on a priori grounds is simply more efficient than a regulatory approach. That argument is correct as far as it goes. The problem is it doesn't go far enough because it assumes that the emissions reduction goal is independent of the tool used to achieve it. Once government derives revenues from the imposition of a greenhouse gas tax, it's very easy to write down a public choice model in which the goal becomes more stringent and the government drives emissions down in a model in which short-sighted, well, forget the word short-sighted, in which public decision makers, senators and congressmen who are driven by a short time horizon, the next election, in other words, who use too high a discount rate view the short-term revenue impact as more important than the long-term revenue impact. That model is not the only public choice model you can apply. There's another model in which public decision makers, congressmen and senators, get campaign contributions not from individuals but from the parties. And because the political parties are long-lived institutions, you can write down a different model in which the incentive to charge too high a tax is much weaker than in the case in which the revenues are redound to the political benefit of the public decision makers much more directly. Those models conflict, and so it's not obvious that a tax approach is less efficient in terms of choosing the emissions goal than a regulatory approach, but I think that the facile assumption that a tax is more efficient than regulation, I think is really quite wrong. Let me turn narrowly, just briefly, to the politics. You know, in 2016, Washington state voters voted on a revenue-neutral carbon tax, Initiative 732. It would have reduced sales and business taxes. It would have increased taxes or the price of gasoline by about 21 cents per gallon this year, rising to about 65 cents in 2050, adjusted for inflation. It lost 59 to 41. In 2018, just last week, Initiative 1631, a non-revenue neutral carbon tax with the revenues about $1 billion a year being distributed to various interests, it would have imposed in 2020, a tax of 13 cents per gallon, rising again to 65 cents in 2050. It lost by 56 to 44. And it's not as if Washington state is a great red state. Maria Cantwell was being reelected to the Senate by what I thought then, when I prepared this slide, was 58 to 42. It turned out to be 59 to 41. And so let's think about the tax that would have to be imposed on gasoline in order to achieve the U.S. COP21 commitment, 27% emissions cut below 2005 levels, which was 7.3 billion tons. So in other words, the commitment was to cut emissions by 2 billion tons by 2025. Well, we've already cut emissions by 800 million tons, mainly because of the substitution of natural gas for coal in power generation. So the total remaining to be cut is 1.2 billion tons, which is 18.5% of that 6.5 billion. Well, if you work through the numbers for the U.S. transport sector, you would have to cut gasoline or transport fuel consumption by 40 billion tons, which is the 18.5%. The question then becomes, how much would you have to raise gasoline prices in order to cut gasoline consumption by 18.5%? Well, if you assume an initial price of $2.85 a gallon and a demand elasticity of 0.5, the tax would have to be not 21 cents a gallon or 65 cents a gallon, but $1.05 per gallon. And if you assume, I think much more realistically, a demand elasticity of 0.3, the tax would have to be $1.77 a gallon. I don't think any Congress dominated by either party is going to pass such a tax. The CLC proposal is to return the revenues as dividends to the American people, which they define as families of four, which actually means the interest groups able to form a majority coalition in Congress. That coalition is likely to change over time and is really going to be very different from the CLC's families of four. That proposal ignores the relative influence of concentrated and unconcentrated pressure groups. It ignores industries and geographic regions bearing disproportionate tax burdens that would have to be compensated. How am I doing on time here?
You got about 4 minutes.
Oh, 4 minutes. Well, I better hustle it up here. The border tax adjustment, carbon, I think is unworkable, frankly. Determining a tax equivalent cost of foreign, subsidies for wind power is a set of calculations very complex and deeply politicized. You would have to take an electronics import from China with components from a dozen different countries, determine transfer prices, exchange rates, et cetera. I don't think the border carbon adjustment is workable. The argument from the CLC that their proposal will reduce the size of government is simply wrong. Ted Halstead claims the carbon tax plus the dividend policy equals revenue neutrality. No, it isn't. It's a new spending program funded by a new tax. It's an increase in resource allocation in which government takes resources from one set of pockets and puts it into a different set of pockets. It's no different than taking the revenues and spending on the defense budget. And there's the further matter that both the CLC and Congressman Curbelo argue for a greater reduction in greenhouse gas emissions than under the Obama Climate Action Plan. That means energy prices would be higher, which means an increase in government resource allocation. The border carbon adjustment would require a vast bureaucracy. The argument that a tax is going to reduce the size of government, I think, is again, not very credible. Then there's the broken windows fallacy, which is not really specific to the Climate Leadership Council. We hear this argument all the time that greenhouse gas policies will force a substitution away from the existing energy capital stock and forced investment in new energy technology. And that's going to make the economy stronger. That's the argument. Well, one way to translate that is the carbon tax destroys part of the economic value of the capital stock and forces investment of scarce resources in new technologies that are not competitive. A broken window is great for the window repair guys. It's not great for the economy. The CLC claims that the bottom 70% of the income distribution would come out ahead. That's simply on the basis of a Treasury Department study. That misrepresents what Treasury said. It said explicitly that their analysis is static. It ignores changes in employment and wages caused by the tax. More expensive energy means less employment and lower wages because energy and employment are complements. If you look at the simple correlations for the bottom three income quintiles between aggregate energy consumption and household incomes, they begin at 0.75 and rise from there. The predictability argument is really problematic. It's not clear why a tax is more predictable than regulation. The CLC calls for a blue ribbon panel after 5 years. Curbelo wants a national climate commission after 2025. There's nothing predictable about these policies. Eventually, I mentioned the tax rate under these proposals rises even after inflation. Eventually, revenues will start declining. How are the dividend payments or the subsidies going to be preserved? I don't think we're going to cut the payments of the subsidies. If the tax rate is lowered, that destroys the predictability argument, more borrowing, et cetera. I think that the carbon tax argument is really much weaker than my fellow economists have been arguing. The CLC and Curbelo, in effect, are arguing that regulation inhibits economic growth, but a carbon tax that yields energy costs even higher would strengthen the economy. I think this is just utter confusion. We can't spend 1 or 2% of GDP on every low probability catastrophe. We should spend money on the ones that we can actually do something about. And I think that in terms of climate policy, it's really better to adopt a policy of adaptation over time. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Ben. Okay, Erwin, over to you.
Okay, well, let me start with this. I used to be at the AEI, and when I was very lucky that the next door neighbor was Bob Bork, and we shared an interest in antitrust policy, so I got to talk to him a lot. And one day, sort of kidding him, I said, Bob, when you taught, you had the honor of teaching both Bill and Hillary Clinton. How do you explain what happened? And he said, I call it a failure of pedagogy. And I think that's what we have here. Let me explain. First of all, let me just tell you my position. My notes say I rise to, but I don't. I'll sit here. I'm here to speak in defense of uncertainty. Now, President Trump is certain that global warming is a hoax. Ben has presented his thing, and I admire the certainty of his predictions. President Obama is certain that it's not a hoax, that the science is, what did he call it, is settled. I'm not so fortunate as to be certain about things. The science that is certain is reflected in climate models, climate models that can't even predict what has already happened accurately, so I'm skeptical about climate models. My position is a pox on such certainty. We're wasting time. We're here. This used to be called, is it still called, the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research? I think that's right. So we're here to talk about making public policy. We're wasting time if we try to decide whether the Earth is warming as a result of carbon emissions or whether climate change, what climate change activists choose to call climate change deniers, which I find particularly offensive, that use of the Holocaust term, but that's what you could expect from someone as graceful as Al Gore. Instead, I think we have to recognize we're faced with making policy in the face of high degree uncertainty. There's nothing new about that. Climate change is no different from when we cut taxes. We don't really know with certainty what the effect will be on economic growth. We don't know when we set tariffs for China whether that will really make them abandon their mercantilism. We're uncertain when we raise the minimum wage whether the benefits to the beneficiaries will be offset by job losses. We're always making policy in uncertainty. Now, because that's the case, we have to ask ourselves, what sort of error are we prepared to make when we make climate policy? You could either do too much too soon or too little too late. I think if the true believers are right, and they might, I say only might, be right, the consequences of climate change are irreversible. So if we get tax policy wrong, we can change it. Although, as I'm sure Doug can tell you, that's not an easy thing to do, changing taxes. He spent a life breaking his, what is it, the expression, breaking your pick on that rock or something rural. I'm trying to, failing is the word, okay. If we get climate policy wrong and side with the opponents of carbon tax, we'll have made an error that cannot be corrected, at least with currently available technology. By the way, the longer we wait, then the higher the cost of addressing this. Now, Ben suggests that adaptation over time is the wiser course. That's where a more precise understanding of the differences between prices and costs is very important. I'm not against encouraging adaptation, but if you encourage adaptation based on a price that does not include all the costs, including the social costs of consuming and producing a product, the adaptation will be suboptimal. So I think that absent a carbon tax, you'll get fewer adaptations, slower adaptations, and wrongly directed adaptations because the bogey will be a price that does not include the social costs, if there are social costs, of consumption and production of this product. Now, it's not true, what Ben concluded with, that a carbon tax will raise the cost of energy. The cost of energy is already being incurred, but the price of energy is not reflecting it. So yes, I do believe that if we have a carbon tax, the price of energy will go up, but the cost will not. The cost is already being incurred, partly by consumers, partly by society as a whole. Now, what if we do impose a carbon tax, and it turns out that the narrative about hoax or is really correct, or more honorably, that we just made a mistake? I think it can be answered only if paired with another. What if it turns out that the climate change narrative is correct, and that a carbon tax is indeed needed, but we don't impose one. Which would be the greater error? Now, surely, too much too soon is the lesser error, in good part because too little too late is irreversible, given the current state of technology. And if it turns out we're doing too much too soon, we can always reverse course. Now, I have yet to meet a conservative who is not upset by the condition, by our fiscal condition. So when I talk to conservatives about carbon taxes, and conservatives are very reluctant to go along with, when they hear the word tax, they don't like it. But they also don't like the fiscal condition we're in. So one of the things one might think about in connection with a carbon tax is that it will generate revenues. I leave it to Doug to talk about that at some length if he wants to. But it will also fall on consumption. It will be a tax on consumption, which has been a long-term conservative objective, to have as much of the tax burden as possible, as reasonable, on consumption rather than on production, rather than on the generation of wealth. And one of the advantages of a carbon tax is that it is a consumption tax. Now, but would all this be sensible? I think there was one slide about the question of border taxes. Now, let's first talk about the legality. I'm not a lawyer, but I'm told by lawyers that the WTO rules allow such a tax, quote, if necessary to protect human, animal, or plant life. And I can't believe there's not some lawyer who can make a case around that. So let's assume legality. Now, does the facts that were laid out about how difficult it is to implement and all of that, they're all true. These are problems associated with almost everything we do when we make policy. Does this open the way for the dreaded lobbyists? Well, you show me something that doesn't in this town. So again, making policy about climate is no more difficult than making policy about, now there are some easy things, but these are issues that we face all the time. And the advantage of a border tax is that it would force countries wishing to market their goods here, and we know how important this market is, to either give up part of the market or to lower their own emissions. Now, will the lobbyists take this perfect theory that I have just laid out for you and turn it to an imperfect practice? Yeah, of course. There's no question about that. Climate policy is no different from any other complex policy making that we have. I mean, you wouldn't fool around with tax policy if you said, I'm not going to do anything that the lobbyists can't affect. That would be unrealistic. If you increase defense spending, will some of the money be wasted? Yeah, it's going to be wasted. Will somebody lobby it for an airplane that we shouldn't have? Yeah, right. So what does that mean? We don't increase defense spending if we need to? So the alternative to accepting the need to expect the unexpected from what seems the best policy and doing nothing is policy paralysis. Now, will there be significant burdens for the less well-off? Not necessarily. We can devote, I think the figure is around 12% from all the studies at Brookings and everything else, and I think Doug has done some studies of this. About 12% of the revenues from a carbon tax can be devoted to offsetting the effect on the lower income people. Does that reduce the efficiency of a carbon tax? Yeah, but we're a democracy. I mean, we have to, efficiency is not our only goal. Equity is part of the goal. And if it takes a slight reduction in efficiency to achieve equity that makes something acceptable in a democratic society, then we've done it before. And we can do it again. Now, let me conclude again by, I think, the most important reference to the pedagogical failure that lurks in the slideshow you have just seen. I feel free to say that, first of all, because Ben is a friend, and second of all, because he referred to something I do as facile. So I figure since you use facile, I can warn these people not to inhale too deeply the smoke from
Irwin,
burning.
I happen to know you have a long list of four-letter words that you reserve for special occasions. Feel free to throw them out.
I do. Usually it's when I'm watching Knick games. And, in any event, prices are not costs. Every economist knows that. They do not include costs that fall on society. It's a circumstance that we call market failure, with which we're very, very familiar. Efficiency and equity both demand that these costs be internalized, and taxes are the most efficient way to do it. A carbon tax will not make energy more expensive, as Ben said. It will increase the price of fossil fuels, for example, but it will not increase their costs. It will make the users and producers pay the full cost. So here's my progression of thinking. Do I have 2 minutes?
Sure.
One, we can't be certain about the state of the planet, whether or not it's warming, and if so, because of human activity. I have no way of adjudicating that dispute. Given this uncertainty, all we can decide is whether the error we're going to make is too much too soon or too little too late. In choosing the error, we have to choose the error that is reversible. If we make policy on the assumption that the planet is not warming, and it is, we've made an irreversible error, not in a legal sense. We've made an irreversible error given the current state of technology. If we make policy on the assumption that the planet is warming, and it isn't, we can correct that error by repealing the tax or diverting the funds to deficit reduction, which I think is perfectly clear at some point we're going to have to do, or have a wonderful inflation that I always enjoyed when I had to pay salaries. And we would have overinvested, by the way, no question, but we would have gotten the benefit of reducing other pollutants if we went after carbon and it turned out we shouldn't have. So how strong is the conservative case for a carbon tax? Very. And for good reasons, because a carbon tax meets several long-term conservative objectives. It minimizes the size of government. Anyone who's wrestled with regulation, as I have all my life before more agencies than you can imagine, will tell you that a tax is more efficient than regulation. And even cap and trade, which is a reasonable second choice, certainly involves government picking what the cap is, who gets it. Look what they did in Europe. Well, if you're really getting hurt, okay, here's a few more permits. Second, the allocation of resources, if you have a carbon tax, is left to consumers and producers. It results, third, in inclusion of all costs, including social costs, in the prices people pay. Fourth, it gives innovators an economically efficient price as the bogey at which they're targeting when they have their innovation. If anyone who has an innovation that can beat the current price of fossil fuels is really not innovating as much as if that price included all the costs. And it has a potential for restoring fiscal sanity to the government. I don't know what more conservatives can ask for. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Irwin. I wouldn't try to summarize these two, but I would say, Irwin, if I had to summarize you, I would say, what if we're wrong?
Pardon me?
What if we're wrong? I mean, that's
could be
probably
wrong.
a simpler way to say. And if you look at Ben says, well, I know we'd be wrong. We'd be much better pay for it as it hits us. You know, the cost of trying to mitigate is much higher than the cost of trying to deal with the problems. He didn't even address my acidification question, but you know, maybe we'll come back to that. I'm sorry. That probably is taking too much prerogative to endeavor to summarize. But why don't we then go to Marlo?
We should go to Doug first.
Doug.
Oh, Doug first.
Yep.
Okay.
That works.
All right.
Well, thanks for the chance to be here today. As Roger mentioned, I've been around this issue for a long time now, but beginning in the late 90s with some academic research, early 2000s with the Congressional Budget Office, McCain's cap and trade campaign proposal in 2007 and 8. So I hope that out of that will come some insights that will be helpful to this audience, but I could be wrong. If we had decided to do something and to limit emissions in the United States, this would be a fairly straightforward issue in policy design. And the first step would be, what should the consumption tax look like? What should the carbon tax look like? And I'd just echo a lot of the things that Erwin just said about the virtues of a carbon tax. It's a consumption tax. It should be a broad-based upstream carbon tax that does not discriminate across sectors or activities or people, and simply applies as efficiently to the economy as a whole. It wouldn't all be on transports like the calculation that Ben did. It wouldn't all be on the electricity generation sector like the Clean Power Plan is. It would be a broad-based consumption tax, and that's something that has an enormous amount of conservative virtue. The second thing you'd have to do is figure out what to do with the revenue, and here I want to wholeheartedly side with Ben on the mistake that would be made by returning this as a dividend. That is, in effect, creating another large entitlement spending program in the United States. We need that like we need cancer or Alzheimer's or any number of other plagues on this society. No, don't do that. The literature says quite clearly what you should do. You should use the revenue to cut distorting taxes on capital and labor. And in the real world, that would mean you should deposit these funds into a lockbox, which doesn't really exist, but which I will design for you, whose sole purpose can be used to reduce the payroll and corporation income taxes, distorting taxes on labor supply and the supply of capital, so as to, in as little as possible, inhibit economic efficiency. And that's the right way to go. It would provide the list of virtues that Erwin did at the end. I won't go through them all, but a price signal for innovators. In the end, we're going to need all that. And it's exactly the right way to deal with this issue. So that's the first part, design a carbon tax, and you'd want to do that. The second thing is, do you pick between that or some sort of regulatory structure? And there, I think there is no question you would pick the carbon tax. And I just would politely disagree with Ben on that point. It's not that somehow tax policy will be certain and regulatory policy will be uncertain. That's not true. Both are uncertain, and I think he's right about that. But it is the case that if you try to do the calculation of how to hit a target, we have some papers at the American Action Forum that do this. We know what carbon tax will do that within the limits of our knowledge, right? But you can't write down the list of regulations that will get the United States that target. You've gone through the list that we know, and now you got to guess at some others that would exist in the future. You also have to know the structure of the economy you're regulating in 2050 or 2060 or 2070. You don't need to know that with a carbon tax. There's an enormous amount of humility that comes with saying, we're just going to tax carbon wherever it enters the economy and however it is used. We don't need to know how the economy will evolve. We want a dynamic economy. We want sectoral reallocations. We want innovations. A carbon tax accommodates all of that. The regulatory approach accommodates none of that. And so there's an enormous advantage to going with the carbon tax. Certainly, in doing the policy design, you'd want to think about some things. For example, if you do the carbon tax, you should get rid of all the existing regulatory approaches. That means a complete federal preemption of the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, NEPA. There is a long list of things where the left would have you, sure, do the carbon tax, that's great, but let's just hold on to this regulatory belt and suspenders, we'll call it. It's it's nice and homespun. It'll be safe. No, it'll be enormously inefficient and costly. So the policy design piece is about getting rid of those in favor of doing something that provides market signals in a very humble and fashion in the face of uncertainty. So I think those are important things to think about. You would do the policy design knowing what other instruments you've had. And I think this gets lost a lot. You could pick between adaptation and mitigation. You could just limit emissions and not pay attention to sea level rise, but that's crazy. You should have a strategy that encompasses both of them, and that will lessen the cost of using any particular instrument to hit a policy target. And so you'd want to think about what other instruments you've got to use in adapting this problem. So that's all sort of the dry technical stuff that we would do if we decided to do something and we're putting together the policy design, which we would then send up to the Congress and let the lobbyists ruin. I mean, we know how that works. That's not why we're in this room. We're in this room because we can't decide whether to do something or not. And There, the fundamental issue is it's not about carbon emissions. It's not about the state of our scientific knowledge. It's not about the capacity of our economy to adapt to any of these policies. It's because the left doesn't care about carbon emissions as much as they'd like to run your life. And carbon emissions are a very convenient way to run your life. So what do you want to do about preserving economic and other freedoms in the face of this policy design question? Well, I still think you want to come down on the side of a carbon tax. It is the one that gives you the smaller government. It is the one that gives you the least ability to reach in and actually tell people how to run their lives. That's what regulations do. And that's what, if you look at like Waxman-Markey, it was a lot about telling you how to live your life, very little about worrying about the emissions. And so that is a threshold question. How can you design it to preserve the most important things to conservatives, which are our principles of freedom and innovation and the kinds of things we want to control with limited government? So I think that's the central issue, and I think that favors the carbon tax. And then lastly, there's the issue of the timing. Do you do it now? Do you do it later? That's at the center of the do too little too late or do too much early. And there, I think Irwin summarized the argument correctly. I'm not going to elaborate on it. I do want to say that I think Ben's done a slight disservice to the insurance industry in general and to the thinking about this in particular, because he's priced the value of insurance at the median forecast. It's all about the tails. And do you want to worry about tail risks? And that's what causes you to move now as opposed to wait, and that's what causes you to be willing to pay a small premium for the possibility of a tail outcome. So I think there are merits on both sides of this argument, but I think on balance it comes down on the side of the carbon tax, and that's the instrument I would choose.
Great. All right. So Marlo, you pick up the pieces, and then let's try to have a little conversation amongst the four of you about these things. Okay, Marlo.
Well, first, just some miscellaneous observations on points that have been made here. I think we ought to recognize that one difference between insurance of the sort that people purchase willingly in the marketplace and the kind of insurance that a carbon tax or any other climate policy might provide is that there is nothing in the policy that makes you whole or even attempts to make you whole when disaster strikes. It's all premium for no benefit. And in fact, if the premiums are too high, to the extent that the economy is smaller and there are fewer resources to deal with disasters when they strike, then the carbon tax insurance has actually made you worse off than you would be otherwise. So that's I think, a real distinction that's usually overlooked in discussions of climate policy as an insurance. I realize that there is kind of a broader metaphorical sense of insurance, like having a bigger nuclear button than the other guy, kind of insures you against the other guy's aggression by deterring attack. But even that doesn't protect you once the bombs fall. And most, real insurance, like fire insurance, will help you pay for the reconstruction of your house if it's damaged. And a carbon tax doesn't do that. No climate policy does that. Another point that Irwin made is that unlike potential climate change damages, the damages to the economy from a carbon tax would be reversible. If we saw that we were harming the economy, we could always stop and reverse course. I'm trying to think of any government program of any magnitude that has ever been abolished, federal program. There are damn few. And the reason is that whether they make sense economically or not, whether they're harmful or beneficial, there are so many interests that grow up around them, that profit from them, that mobilize and lobby, not just for their perpetuation, but their expansion, that you never get rid of them. And I'm thinking in particular of the income tax as it's presently structured, which I think every conservative has decried as a terrible concoction with all kinds of barnacles and layers that have accumulated over decades. And although we've seen some real tax reform, in just recent years, nothing like a fundamental change of approach. For example, a flat tax, which was very popular for a while among conservatives, or a switch to a real consumption tax, which it's something that I've always thought was a great idea, because then the decision to be taxed would really not be the government's. It would be the voluntary choices of the consumer. I only am taxed if I really want to buy that new car. That would fundamentally change, for example, the balance of power between the citizen and the government. I don't think we'll ever have that, and it's because it's really hard to undo the 16th Amendment. So these things get to be irreversible very fast. Another point that Irwin made that I would like to comment on is that without a carbon price, the adaptations are likely to be suboptimal. And I don't quite get that, because in a free market, people and businesses and communities are continually adapting to all kinds of things, not just changes in the local, regional, or global climate, but changes in the economy and technology all the time. And what facilitates those adaptations so that people use their money in order to improve the welfare and health of themselves and their families is that they have money to spend. Again, if you make the economy smaller, if you impoverish certain portions of the population in particular through a tax that falls disproportionately on only certain sectors of the economy, then certain people will be a lot less able to adapt than they otherwise would be. So I think you can make a case that a carbon tax, to the extent that it actually has a measurable effect on the economy, will reduce at least some significant segment of the economy's ability to engage in adaptation. Now, I came prepared, Ben, to deliver a few remarks of my own, how much time do I have, Roger?
About 5 minutes.
Okay, good. I can fit it all in. One thing that has always bugged me about the conservative case for a carbon tax is that it attempts to argue that it's good for conservatives to do this without ever considering whether the carbon tax itself will benefit or harm the conservative movement. And I think you can make a very strong case that a carbon tax would be a policy of political suicide for the conservative movement, that the conservative movement cannot rally around this and get on board with it without destroying itself. And that's because Doug mentioned the left and how determined these people are, to control our lives, not just through regulation, but tax policy, all kinds of policies. And so what we have in this country, what we've had for decades, but it's really building to a crescendo, is a struggle for hearts and minds. And this struggle is to no small degree a contest between a conservative movement that is pro-energy and anti-tax and a progressive movement that is pro-tax and anti-energy. Now, of course, they'll say, oh, we like energy too. Yeah, you like 2 or 3% of the energy supply system. The rest, including nuclear and large hydro, you'd like to get rid of. So it's really pro-energy, anti-tax versus pro-tax, anti-energy. And that is a clear product differentiation that gives conservatives an enormous advantage in American politics. And it's because it's an asset that is motivating millions of people to support conservative candidates. I think it's one of the reasons that Donald Trump pulled off his surprise election victory. After all, that was really a big part of his campaign. I'm going to cut taxes and I'm going to remove the burdens on America's energy sector. Because I think, as you know, his pro-growth energy agenda really is a core component of his overall Make America Great Again economic program. And if Trump had basically followed the advice of the carbon tax elders, the Climate Leadership Council, and endorsed the carbon tax as a candidate, I think it's almost certain he would have lost in the primaries. All the other either nominal or real conservatives in that race, all 16 others, would have condemned him for it. And even if by some miracle he would have won, he would never have fired up the same kind of support in coal country, in the industrial heartland, in rural America. Very likely we'd have Hillary Clinton as president today, and then we would have what? We would have no major tax cuts, no aggressive deregulation, no record-breaking oil and gas leases, and no 3% GDP growth. And where would the conservative movement be today? I mean, right now we have more strength than we've had since Reagan, and I think it's largely because Trump was true to this understanding that I've articulated here. Not necessarily that he did himself, but he understood these are fundamental alternatives here. You can be pro-energy and anti-tax, or pro-tax and anti-energy, and you really can't mix up those two things without dividing your coalition and demoralizing your base. And so I am, I can't help, I'm not an economist. I look at this mostly as a political analyst, and I don't see how a conservative carbon tax can have a very strong case when it would be politically toxic to the conservative movement. And just how much more time do I have now, Roger?
About 30 seconds.
30 seconds. Well, I would just say this, again, piggybacking off of Doug's comment about the left. We should always remember our first Chief Justice's great motto that the power to tax involves the power to destroy. And a carbon tax, obviously, has a unique potential to bankrupt about 80% of the U.S. energy sector. And all of these carbon tax proposals, as Ben pointed out, ratchet up over time by design. And if we were actually to enact any one of those, two very influential factions, Washington's big spenders and also the global warming movement, would continually demand that the tax be increased even faster. So my big worry, and Doug Irwin talked about risks, my worry is that if we enact a carbon tax, then we cross a political Rubicon. We will be forever debating how high the carbon tax should be. And conservatives have more than enough big government to worry about already. The last thing we should want to do is arm politicians with a new weapon of legal plunder.
So we mostly avoided politics until we got to
I'm
you.
not an
We're
economist.
sort
I can
of
only do
talking
what I
about
can
the
do.
merits of the idea versus how would it play. But
Right.
nonetheless, I'm kind of dying to see if you really agree there's some risk out there, how you would deal with it otherwise. But you didn't say anything about that. But we can hopefully come back to that. One of the things that
Can I say something about that?
Yeah, sure.
So I want to emphasize that I think there's a conservative case for a well-designed carbon tax policy, but not any carbon tax. And as I said, the right way to do this means you don't raise taxes. You impose a carbon tax and you get rid of taxes on labor and capital. That would be corporation, personal income, payroll taxes. That has to be an integral part of the design. And the politics of that's why I want to have a fund where you put the money into that fund. Social Security Trust Fund is an economic fraud, but it's been a politically very durable mechanism to make sure something happened. That's what you need to design here. So if they decide to ratchet up the carbon tax, you're cutting the other ones automatically.
Let me pick up.
And that's important in the politics for conservatives. It is. You cannot be growing the government with this thing.
Can I pick up on that a bit? Because Ben made the assertion that it costs 1% to 2% of GDP. You didn't really back that up very much, but you made that assertion. All of us have seen data that says if you really design a revenue-neutral carbon tax the way you're talking about it, Doug, it would have zero impact on GDP growth. In fact, it could be a positive if it was structured correctly. So I wanted to see if there's any, this is coming from RFF, which I think is a pretty straight player in all of this and probably done the most work on it. If that's true, And I want to see if you disagree strongly with that. If it's true, then it's a very different case than the one you're making, Ben. Your cost-benefit analysis kind of falls apart if your 1 to 2% is wrong.
No, not really. If you believe that the actual climate effects of these policies would be effectively zero, which if you use the EPA climate model, that's what falls out of it, then there's no way to justify these policies on benefit cost grounds. If you want to argue, as Doug seems to be, that we'd be better off with a carbon tax combined with a reduction in payroll and capital taxation, I have serious doubts about the political viability of that trade. But that's a different set of issues. Then why a carbon tax? Why not a tax on zucchini or something? I mean, what is
We're
it
really
about
trying to reduce the risk,
well,
right?
but the point is, you're not reducing the risk. If
You didn't live through the sulfur dioxide like I did. You know, that was the price on sulfur dioxide was probably the most impressive policy initiative I ever lived under, and we did so many creative things, and I just wonder why you don't give credit to that. But it's all right.
But we're not talking about a tax on sulfur dioxide or criteria pollutants. We're talking about a tax basically on carbon dioxide. And the question is, what climate effects would a tax have? And for the U.S. alone, it's effectively zero. And for the world writ large, if you assume the Paris Agreement as a benchmark, then it's very small. It's about half a degree. What's that worth?
But everybody knows the Paris Agreement's a joke.
Well, fine, but if it's a joke, then that weakens your argument even more.
No, it doesn't.
Of course it does,
I'll
because
tell you
then
why
you're
it
paying.
doesn't.
Okay.
It clears away the feeling that they've accomplished something when they haven't. So then you say to yourself, if this is a problem, if this is really a problem, and you don't think it is, but for people who think it is, they're deluding themselves that something wonderful happened in Paris. Now, I know they served nice hors d'oeuvres and it was a terrific meeting, but that if you delude yourself into thinking that, A, the rich countries are going to transfer $100 billion a year to poor countries, which they're not, and that the poor countries are going to keep to the promises they made in this, then you say, ooh, whoopee, everything is solved, I'm going to go home and have a good time. So I think Paris was a real diversion. Eliminating Paris then lets you get down to really...
So let me summarize, Erwin. Years of negotiations, decades of negotiations that yielded what you describe, and I agree, is a joke. If we shun it aside, somehow we'll get something even stronger.
Well, look what's happening. Look exactly what's happening. Two things happened. One is Paris isn't going to work. He'll agree that. The other thing is we elected Trump, who every Democratic mayor and governor hates. So now they've got a great chance to stick a thumb in Trump's eye by doing all sorts of the things that you would call amelioration or whatever adaptation. The whole movement for energy companies who know, by the way, that the depreciated value of their assets has gone way up. They know that. I had an unfortunately long paper, which I decided was too long, to indicate what people are doing to take steps to reduce carbon emissions. Can I ask one question here that I didn't understand? Doug, you said that you want to eliminate the regulations.
Yes.
Right. Okay, so I do too, but I then decided that that's never going to happen. I once thought we could have a grand bargain. Roger would get the really right-thinking green movement to sit down with conservatives, and we would say, we do this.
It just turned out to be him.
Pardon me? It turned out to be him. It was a one-man movement. And they would give up the regulations, and we would get the carbon tax. It's not going to happen. So the question is, would you, assuming you cannot get rid of all those regulations, which I'm now assuming, would you still be for a carbon tax?
That would be, I'd have to literally see the deal. I mean, I would not in advance sign off to that, because you could imagine, so the basic issue with the regulatory approach, if you sort of say you want to hit a target at 2050, is we can't specify how to get there.
Right.
So you have to imagine a newer, more aggressive, intrusive regulatory approach that hasn't yet been found And that's extremely costly. You're running up the marginal cost curve of these regulations, and all our research shows
if
that.
they're all
so,
there, would
so
you
you're
be
saying
for
that
carbon tax?
somehow we're just going to stop
Layer it
here
on.
and it'll be okay.
No, I would like to get rid of them, but I know I can't.
It's not
so
the
what
most
do I do next?
efficient, so
I'm
but
making
maybe it would
policy.
be okay. But maybe it wouldn't. I'd have to look
Right.
actually in the moment. See.
Okay.
I mean, honestly, I don't know how you know that in advance.
Well, I at least asked the question about this 1 to 2%.
I'm sympathetic.
Did you all
Yeah, no,
want to make any comments
Yes.
about that? I mean, you all said
I'd like
it.
to, Roger, and it's not being an economist again. Of course, I haven't done
Clearly.
the study myself or audited in any kind of technical way, but Capital Alpha Partners just this week released a study in which they look at 6 different scenarios for a carbon tax. The scenarios differ in terms, in some of them, in terms of how high the carbon tax gets, but it's mostly the ways in which the revenue would be recycled and used for various kinds of tax reforms. And they include a proposal that's very much like the Carbon Leadership Council's proposal of dividends handed out to everyone on an equal basis. To me, that just sounds like Huey Long, share the wealth.
Right.
But anyway, that's not what they say. What they conclude is that the only scenario in which it is possible, they don't even say this is definite, that the carbon tax would actually have a pro-growth effect by reducing other taxes is if almost all the reduction were in corporate taxes, in which case the carbon tax would be quite regressive. And so,
Everybody agrees with
basically
that.
the equity concern that you mentioned, Erwin, would just have to go by the boards.
No, wait, that's wrong. You were right up to that last by the boards business.
I'm talking about in their study.
Yeah, I'm saying all the studies, and Doug, and I was just sitting when Doug did some of them, all the studies show that the most effect would be if you lowered capital taxes on capital the most. Yes. Everybody who does that looks at that and says, ugh, that's going to be really difficult. So what we want to do is at least allocate some of the funds to reduce the effect on lower income people. But
their
there's no
conclusion
question
is if you do that,
But
then
that's-
it's not pro-growth. It will reduce the overall size of the
You know
economy
better
relative to what it would be
Steel
otherwise.
spine, Erwin. No, give them nothing. I mean, this is my point on the policy design. You don't have to solve every problem with the carbon tax or something. We have an enormous federal government spending side where we can take care of low-income people and make sure they live adequately. Period. That's what it's there for. Let it do it. Mm-hmm. This is designed, if you believe there's a problem, to price carbon and do it in as economically efficient fashion as possible. We should just do that.
I stand corrected. How's that?
Don't negotiate with yourself. Never.
And if
I agree with that, Doug.
And if you believe that the political incentives engendered by a carbon tax will result in a tax that is too high and greenhouse gas emissions that are too low, then what conclusion do you draw from that?
And you change the tax.
But that's the point, Erwin, that in what I think is a very sensible public choice model, the tax results in lower greenhouse gas emissions systematically than a regulatory approach. And in fact, I think it results in emissions that are too low.
It's one of the
rather
reasons
than too
cap and
high.
trade was popular for a long time, just because you thought you're trying to achieve a goal and let the market clear at whatever.
Well, but you
price
have to
that is, but
you have to
nonetheless.
establish the number of permits, and that gets.
Yeah.
Well, let me stop us here and turn to all of you who I'm sure have more persuasive arguments than maybe some of us. So why don't we start with you, Maribel?
If you could wait for the microphone, please. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, this was an outstanding presentation and set of remarks. As Roger knows, and Doug and Erwin having had a lot of history in this area, I have a few thoughts. The first is I actually do think there is potential for a bargain. To do something on climate would be so important. I do think there's an potential for a bargain with the green community. and have had some experience with precedent on that, certainly when we were working on the U.S. Climate Action Partnership and we came up with a resolution that didn't get through Congress, only got through the House with one vote, et cetera. One of the big issues on that was sort of a great reduction in EPA regulations at the time. But secondly, I'd like to pose a question to the panel. President Trump has talked about clean air and clean water as being very important, which is, the notion of the environmental issue. It is the second half of a four-year administration. It might be nice to have something that the Trump administration can say positively about the environment as they run for re-election or as the Republican Party runs for re-election 2 years from now for the White House. Listening to pieces of this, I guess the question is, first, has anyone explored any of these ideas with senior members of the cabinet or the Trump administration? But isn't there a way to have some combination of low carbon impact beyond renewables that doesn't in any way discount renewables, but puts in the composition nuclear, advanced CCS research or advancing that sector, and at the same time, and also hydro. Is there not a bargain to be made, or at least an idea that might have some legs within this administration as they look up the run for the next 2 years?
The expansion of renewable power has the effect of increasing, not reducing emissions.
This is true, and that's why
criteria pollutants and greenhouse gases.
And that's exactly why I asked. I have some familiarity with this in saturated markets, that a concept that is beyond renewables for low carbon impact, and then takes a look at grid citizenship, and then includes nuclear, et cetera.
Well, there's one, it's the last et cetera that you had there. There's no question that if you're right, that at all costs the conservative movement must support the digging of coal, no matter what, because that's part of I'm for growth and I'm for...
Only if it's economical to do so. I'm not for government,
Yeah, well, it'll remain economical if you don't include the social costs.
Don't include the social
Right.
costs.
Well, all right.
But wait, hold on. Let me finish my point.
I need
There
to
is something
respond to
lurking out there called nuclear power, right? Everybody loves nuclear power.
No,
So
that's false. The Greenies hate it.
Wait, can I finish? Nuclear power, there's a small problem with nuclear power. It bankrupts everybody who comes in contact with it. So that, pardon me? Well, previously bankrupted nuclear, of course, doesn't. I mean, what you want to be is the guy who gets the nuclear plant that has already gone bankrupt so that you don't have to pay the capital costs. Then maybe you could cover the operating costs, but that's not at all clear anymore. So other than that, if you're trying to configure the energy economy for, let's call it a decade, you took longer, but for decades to come, you can't. You can't. You can only do it with a carbon tax. You can't do it any other way.
I'm going to try to move this along because it's such a great question. We could go on for a while, but there are a lot of others who would like to. Yes, sir.
Hi, thanks for the discussion. Jeff Epping with Energis LLC. Excuse me. I just wonder what the panel thinks of the recent 45Q tax credit that was passed in February. The 45Q tax credit, it gives a credit for sequestering carbon at $35 and $50 a ton, depending on how you do it. It has limited scope and all, but I just wondered if there's any comment from the panelists on it.
I will tell you I've lost a lot of money on carbon sequestration, so I'm probably a little bit biased. I still believe it could be in the $30 range, and I always wondered why the coal industry didn't think a carbon tax might be a great way to keep coal in the business. Because if you could sequester carbon, maybe they could be a part of the competition. But, if it's $60, maybe that's a little harder. But regardless, I think it's a thoughtful proposal, but I don't know whether it'll go anywhere.
I have a less gracious interpretation, which is it continues a long tradition of junk tax policy in the name of environmental and energy objectives. I mean, we have got all these rinky-dinky production tax credits, investment tax credits, different types of power, different rates, completely distortionary. It should all go away.
Amen.
Roger,
Yeah,
we
hear,
now
hear.
know what you are. It's just a question of your price, right?
Yes, that's right. Exactly.
Now, that's me and Irwin.
Yes.
Please. Yes, yes sir.
I'm, as a 35-year environmentalist who worked on the Trump transition on EPA, I can say with some confidence that there was never an intent to go forward with social cost of carbon. The decision was not to try to fix it, was to get rid of it. And the reason for it is in large measure, as Irwin doesn't seem to realize, is that the cost that has been applied to carbon has not adequately incorporated the benefits from increased CO2 as well.
From increased what?
CO2.
CO2.
Now, I would like to make one correction. The ocean is not acidifying. It's not acid in the first place. It's changing its base structure. It's heavily buffered. And the data
more.
suggesting that there's a cataclysmic event is as poor as a concern over the increases in temperature. But all that not...
You scuba dive?
I do, but, you know, you can, this is not the time to argue that issue. With regard to the economics, though, I don't see, having spent as much time in the government as the other folks here whose hair used to be something different colored than it is today, that government's going to shrink. I mean, Trump told us EPA has to go away. And I said EPA can't go away. And I was directed to find a way to make EPA to go away. And the only way to make EPA to go away was to give pieces of it to somebody else. But it didn't really go away. And it is my concern that precisely the question is not, is it too little too late or too much too soon? It gets back to the more basic question of opportunity costs. How are we going to spend the money we're going to spend? And I have to agree with Ben. You don't spend it on something that is of so little moment, even by the environmental community. They admit that these models show so little moment and that the models are so bad that it is not a wise investment. So the premise of arguing how to create a carbon tax should begin with whether we need one at all.
Anybody want to comment or should
Yeah, can I just ask, so is that a question of the discount rate that you apply to the possible harm? I mean, are you talking about the fact that you don't want to do something for an event of 10 or 20 years from now, or that you don't want to do something because it's a low probability event in any event?
I'm saying that between, it's the same point Ben made. How many low probability events can we afford?
Yeah.
And this is just one.
This is Oren's
Now,
point.
the discount rate issue is much more fundamental. If you look at the Obama administration calculation of the social cost of carbon, and you use the major integrated assessment models, Bill Nordhaus's DICE model, Richard Toll's fund model, if you use a 7% discount rate, which is the rate mandated by OMB regulations, the social cost of carbon is either close to zero or actually negative. That's why the Obama administration used a 3% discount rate, or 2.5 and 3, in order to justify its calculation of the social cost of carbon. In the regulatory impact analysis of the Clean Power Plan, they discounted the costs at 5% and the benefits at 3%. I mean, I have described before congressional committees the Obama administration calculation of the social cost of carbon as the single most dishonest exercise in political arithmetic that I've ever seen produced by the federal bureaucracy.
Can I make one comment about that, Ben or Roger? You know, the Obama administration's social cost of carbon got 60% higher in just 4 years, as if in the analysis of a problem that supposedly spans centuries, which has been ongoing for at least a century, got 60% worse in just 4 years. what that shows you, I think, is how easy it is to manipulate the various knobs and dials of the social cost of carbon to get any result, almost any result, that the modelers desire. This was the critique that Robert Pindyck at MIT made. And so there was another point I was going to make about the social cost of carbon that just went out of my head.
All right,
Ben, what were you saying there about the dishonest exercise?
Yeah,
But
every, the co-benefits approach.
This was it about the discount rates. It was really interesting. There was a study that was done, I think around 2013 by Chris Hope, who is the architect of the Page model, which is the third of these models. And basically said, well, because of intergenerational equity, we should really set the discount rate at 1%. And then guess what? Already in the year 2010, the social cost of carbon is $266 a ton. And, well, what does that mean? Well, that means that new solar is already more economical, more efficient than existing coal. And so that was a real bolt of lightning for me, because what I could see right then was the social cost of carbon is a way of giving a scientific facade to a line of chatter which basically says renewable energy, or alternatively carbon dioxide regulations, are a bargain at any price, or fossil fuels are always are always unaffordable no matter how cheap. And if you think about that, I mean, that is a real con game. That's exactly what a pitchman would tell you about anything, that his product is you can't afford to pass it up no matter how expensive it is, and the competitor's product is always unaffordable no matter how cheap it may seem. Right. And so that's the kind of game playing that goes on with the social cost of carbon. I agree that there are externalities, Irwin. I think some are positive, some are negative, but the pretense, or that the claim that we can somehow quantify these objectively, is a pretense of knowledge and illusory.
I'm going to ask one more question, but before I finish, I'm going to ask you all to let me know if you think the conservative case is strong, and by just a raise of hand. So be prepared for that vote. You were next out there. You, and the orange shirt.
Thank you. So I guess my question is for you, Ben. Your calculation of sort of 1 to 2% of GDP proceeds basically from the premise that, or at least from a calculation that the cost of climate change will not be higher than that in a way that's difficult to account for, which is the externality that Irwin was discussing.
Go ahead.
Another sort of further on, what you stated was that sort of the prevented warming would be about 0.5 degrees Celsius, which the science suggests would actually be fairly significant under the aggressive policy. But the issue is that would not be enough, that the issue of the tax wouldn't be enough to do a lot, but that politicians would have an incentive to raise it above the efficient levels. If you instead take the premise that warming would be more expensive, then there's not as much of a risk that the tax would overshoot the socially efficient level of revenue raised from the tax. So I guess I would just like to know sort of what the comparison is between the business as usual projection.
Yeah, I think I heard two questions there. One on the 1 to 2% of GDP. The RFF study is deeply flawed. I haven't got time here to get into it, but it's really a terrible piece of work. The point is not that 1 or 2% of GDP is a high number or a low number. The question is whether it's worth spending to get climate effects from greenhouse gas policies that are trivially small. That's the point. With respect to the second point, in terms of the cost of climate change itself, the problem, and Doug alluded to a tail argument, a tail insurance argument. The problem is that there are three tails, not just one. There's a tail of potential benefits from anthropogenic warming with probability one, there's going to be a future glaciation, whether soon or distant in time. Anthropogenic warming, in that case, might be a huge benefit. And there's also the tail of unanticipated adverse effects of government policy, which is something that Marlowe referred to. That is not something to be ignored, to put it mildly. So I think that in terms of, and even that aside, there's simply no evidence yet of serious adverse effects from increasing greenhouse gas concentrations. If you look at, it's certainly true that they're having an effect, and I think the latest research shows that anthropogenic temperature effects are around 0.5 degree over the last 50 or so years, something like that. Nick Lewis, well, Joe will correct me in a minute. But if you look at the data on cyclones, on tornadoes, if you look at the Palmer Drought Severity Index, if you look at the wildfire data, if you look at a number, there's no evidence that serious effects are already emerging from greenhouse gas concentrations. Now, maybe that evidence will emerge over time, that's fine, but thus far, the argument that we're already seeing hugely adverse effects is simply not consistent with the data that I have seen.
Joe, do you want to?
Yeah, Joe, wait for the microphone, okay?
That means he's going to say something that agrees with you, right?
No, he's not. Joe, are you kidding?
I don't know.
He's going to beat up on me as much as he can possibly get away with.
Joseph Mike at Scannon Center. I actually want to return to something Ben's been focusing on, and not get into a science argument. It's not really the right venue, but the social cost of carbon is, I think, an interesting construct, and actually betrays one of the reasons why we should think about setting climate policy via legislation, which is what carbon tax would do, versus via regulation, right? Because you can monkey around with a social cost of carbon calculation in really perverse ways. You've all studied this for a long time. You brought it up. So I'm kind of interested in putting you on the spot. What do you think is a range of reasonable values? Not that gets set by OMB, not that gets set by the discount rate specified for federal regulations, but how should we think about that? Or is it a construct, as Marlowe has hinted at, we should just throw out altogether?
Well, you go. You've been playing with these numbers.
But we haven't been doing the benefit calculations. We've been doing the tax policy. So
Well,
the social if you ignore the tail probabilities of benefits, and if you ignore the adverse tail of adverse effects from government policy, and simply accept the Obama administration calculations under the assumptions that they made, and use some sort of discount rate that really does reflect the, you're laughing at me already.
you've completely stacked the deck. So, let's first of all completely ignore the Obama administration's calculation because it doesn't bear any relation to the actual question, which is, in the real world, how should we value carbon?
Well,
you're right about the criticism. It's a terrible calculation. Second thing is, the answer to your question is, tell me the discount rate and I can tell you the answer. Because you can make it anything you want. And that's a fundamental hard problem, honestly. That is.
That's why the most policymakers trying to make policy suggest we start low and see what happens.
But he was asking, what's in your gut? You know, you've been around this a long time, Doug. If you had to pick a number, you advocate a carbon tax. Yeah, right now. What would it be?
$15 a ton.
Where do you get that number?
Oh my God, he asked me to do it. I'll give you my estimated GDP in 2030
I'm thinking a different part of your anatomy, Doug.
Same quality.
And how about you, Erwin? What do you?
Well, look, all the studies I've read and your dismissal of it. I mean, guys like Nordhaus and people like that are really
Nordhaus just got a Nobel.
I don't believe so much in Nobels, but these are responsible scholars who, according to you, are just going around completely flawed.
I didn't say that.
No, I know, but I can't find anything you didn't say that about. So I'm picking Nordhaus as a possibility you might be willing to consider. If it were up to me, I would start at $20. Where did I get it from? I've talked to a lot of people who say that that's the number that will begin to have some effect on consumption if what you're after is reducing consumption of carbon-emitting fuels. Would I buy 15? Yeah.
Given the uncertainties, they're the same number.
Given the uncertainties, they're the same number. But could I ask one more question?
Well, you can't because we're 1 minute over. And
So,
I
but
promise-
everybody's staying.
Well, I know.
But one more question.
All right.
If you're right, and if the fiscal condition of the country is what it is, where would you go for more money that is more efficient than a consumption tax?
That's a different
You're
question.
asking me, Irwin.
I'm asking you, I'm asking you,
That's
I'm
a
asking
definite-
anybody who's got a
that's
great
definite
idea.
question.
Well, it used to be a conservative policy to try to cut spending. And, and I think we need to somehow get back to that. It's tough, obviously. Otherwise, it would have happened already. But I remember my colleague, David Kreutzmann, when he was at Heritage Foundation, once had a public conversation with Andrew Moylan, who was at the time at the R Street Institute, which was advocating a conservative carbon tax. Mm-hmm. And Andrew basically made this case, the deficits are piling up year by year, and so we need a new source of revenue. And David pointed out that before joining the R Street Institute, Andrew, over at National Taxpayers Union, had produced a report laying out dozens, maybe scores of options to cut spending, which would have produced more savings in the budget than the carbon tax would have raised. And so he asked Andrew, why aren't you for that now? And I don't remember what the answer was. But, that used to be like a cottage industry among conservative groups, was to find opportunities to cut spending, find ways of somehow disciplining the entitlement state. I'm afraid that conservatives seem to have given up, but that's the other side of the equation. Maybe AEI should have a panel discussion on that.
Well,
the neglected question.
So let me conclude, and I promise you, I get you all a chance to vote. You don't get asked questions, but you get to vote. So, how many of you think the conservative case for a carbon tax is strong? Is that about a third? Something like that. How many think?
I count 50.
How many think is weak? And how many don't know? Okay. All right. It's been fun, you guys. Thank you for stimulating this panel.
Thank you. Okay. Nice to see you, Doug. Irwin, a pleasure to meet you.
It's nice to meet you.
Yeah.